can tell that those are almost entirely men's hats. I think there's a woman's hat there. But they're few and far between. This was a mob that was antagonistic to these women. They were shouting vile things at them. They were throwing eggs. They were pushing in on the women. And they literally had to send in the cavalry. Fort Myer is just across the river, and they arranged for the cavalry to come across the river from Fort Myer, and the cavalry cleared a path so that these women could proceed ahead with their parade. There was a little incident. There was a contingent of college women. Now women were starting to graduate from college, and except for, you know, the few oddballs from Oberlin that had been out there for a long time. So the college women were marching, and the women from Howard University wanted to march with them. Well, Carrie Chapman Catt decided that this would upset the Southern women, and she refused to let the women from Howard University march with the other college women. But Ida Wells Barnett, you remember, back from Illinois, anti-lynching? Ida B. Wells stood at the edge of the crowd until the Illinois delegation started to move down the parade route, and she stepped out. The Illinois delegation took her in with them, and she marched with the Illinois delegation in that parade. The parade concluded with a pageant on the steps of the Treasury building, and this is Inez Milholland, who I will show you much closer later, who was considered to be the most beautiful woman in the suffrage movement. Helmets are not particularly attractive, and this is not a particularly becoming outfit, but again, all of this is something that just gives it enormous publicity. And Alice Paul never repeated anything. She did this parade, okay, that's it, we've done parades, we'll move on to something else, you know? Meanwhile, Carrie Chapman Catt had to give up her women's suffrage work because both her husband and her mother were dying. She took care of them. She threw herself into the international suffrage movement, so she wasn't around for a lot of the dysfunction in the Nassau. And then her husband and her mother, well, they died, and Mrs. Frank Leslie died and left Carrie Chapman Catt $2 million and a bunch of jewelry, including a sapphire necklace, to use for the women's suffrage cause. Incidentally, Nancy Newman sold the sapphire necklace to help support the ERA when she was president of the league. No? No.
That was so long before that.
Long before that. Okay. Carrie Chapman Catt came back as president and announced that she had a secret plan. She was going to use this money, and she was going to carry out this secret plan. She also kicked Alice Paul out. The secret plan basically was first to get a few more states besides Illinois east of the Mississippi. You needed some of the big states. You needed New York or Massachusetts or, hopelessly, Pennsylvania. And then you also needed a southern state. They're going to pick up Arkansas. And then she figured you could argue that this was not just a Western thing, but this was a national movement, and you could then lobby for the Anthony Amendment. So, Carrie Chapman Clapp kicks out everybody that wanted to work part-time for women's suffrage, got a full-time board, and went to work. Alice Paul organized a cross-country driving trip by a woman. This was extraordinary. No woman had ever driven across the country before. Every night, she stops, she gets local publicity, she makes speeches, right? And then Alice Paul organizes a whistle-stop campaign. This is one of these deals where the train pulls into the depot and stops, and you speak from the back of the train. And the speaker on that was, again, the most beautiful woman in the women's suffrage movement, who was Inez Milholland. She started this campaign. She did not feel well when she began. She collapsed on stage in 1916, was carted off to the hospital, and died a month later. She is considered the American martyr to the cause of women's suffrage. Now, you may be wondering why you never heard of her. And most of you have probably never heard of her. The reason is that the history of this was written by Carrie Chapman Catt. And Carrie Chapman Catt did not have much patience with these publicity efforts. Alice Paul's group, which will become the Woman's Party, did not write a history. So, people like Inez Milholland get diminished because of what the major source immediately afterwards was. Okay? The same thing is true of Lucy Stone. Lucy Stone in her time was as important as Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the history and gave Lucy Stone one small chapter. Okay, so, meanwhile, Carrie Chapman Catt is busy organizing, and she's doing things like creating suffrage universities. She had training sessions for women in all the states on how to lobby, how to organize, how to attract new members, so that she is getting a solid base set up, hopefully in each state, right? Alice Paul is picketing the White House. It is the first time in American history that anyone picketed the White House. Now, if you picket the White House, nobody pays any attention. But this was a great big deal because it was the first time.